Inside the wood-paneled study of a requisitioned Bavarian manor house in May 1945, the air smells of wet wool and damp pine. Standing by the window is General von Berg, a 61-year-old Wehrmacht division commander whose uniform is missing every medal except his collar tabs, his hands resting lightly on the silver hilt of a Prussian cavalry dress saber. Without a word, the silver-haired officer unhooks the heavy scabbard from his belt and steps across the Persian rug toward General George S. Patton, Jr. He holds the weapon horizontally in both palms, extending the family heirloom across the polished mahogany desk as a formal token of surrender. The Third Army staff officers surrounding the table freeze. Major Thomas Higgins catches his breath as his fingers twitch over his holster, while two aides instantly stop mid-sentence with their field maps still unrolled. Nobody moves, nobody breathes, and the entire room waits for the explosive reaction that normally follows any unsolicited gesture from a defeated enemy. Patton looks at the heavy silver hilt resting between them, his jaw setting as the silence expands into every corner of the grand study. He does not reach for the steel, nor does he order the guards forward. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal the hidden compass inside one of America's most relentless commanders. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button right now. Your support allows us to keep bringing these forgotten moments of history back to life. Let me back up a second, because to understand what was actually happening in that room, you need to understand what a field headquarters in Bavaria felt like in the spring of 1945. May 1945 in southern Germany was a strange, tense period of total collapse. Patton's Third Army had smashed through the heart of the Reich, driving deep into the Bavarian mountains and converting grand aristocratic manors into fast-moving operational nerve centers. Tactical overlays were pinned over centuries-old oil paintings, telephone wires snaked through carved oak corridors, and mud-caked boots tracked dirt onto polished parquet floors. It was an environment thick with the friction of fresh victory and total capitulation. German surrender delegations were arriving constantly, broken, exhausted officers trying to navigate the end of their world. The air inside those rooms smelled of wet wool, stale coffee, and burnt paper as American staff officers worked 20-hour days processing the downfall of a nation. The unwritten rules of those final days were brutal and absolute. Allied command had mandated unconditional surrender, leaving no room for traditional chivalry or military protocol. Standard operating procedure required enemy officers to be stripped of their weapons, searched, and catalogued with mechanical efficiency long before they reached senior leadership. Sidearms were taken, credentials checked, and deference denied. To unbuckle a weapon inside a commanding general's private office was not just a protocol breach, it was a severe security threat. Every American officer in that room had spent years in a war where unexpected movements meant hidden weapons or desperate acts of violence. Nobody knew if the silver sword was a genuine offer or an unscripted breach of discipline that could trigger a quick-drawn sidearm. Outside the window lay an operational landscape governed by unforgiving military arithmetic. The Third Army was managing the capitulation of hundreds of thousands of enemy troops spread across thousands of square miles. Every single day required calculating the cost of disarming, housing, and feeding nearly 300,000 prisoners of war. The operational ledger was relentless. Thousands of tons of rations required daily, hundreds of kilometers of road clogged with defeated divisions, and endless inventories of captured armaments that had to be confiscated and melted down. In a mathematical machine built to process millions of men and tons of discarded steel, there was no line item for personal honor or antique traditions, and that was the room General von Berg stepped into. Picture the scene. It is early afternoon inside the requisitioned manor house. Sunlight filters through tall leaded glass windows, cutting through suspended dust motes and drifting cigarette smoke. 12 senior officers stand around a long mahogany table scattered with grease pencil maps and empty coffee mugs. The temperature inside the room is cool and stagnant, smelling of wet wool coats, old leather, and floor wax. In the middle of this operational clutter stands General von Berg, immaculate despite his fatigue, his silver hair reflecting the grey daylight. Across the table stands Patton, wearing his spotless olive-drab uniform, 3 stars gleaming on his collar, his ivory-handled revolvers resting against his hip. The contrast between victor and vanquished is sharp, precise, and absolute. Major Thomas Higgins and the rest of the staff officers had seen dozens of enemy surrenders that week, but none like this. They watched the silver hilt of the Prussian saber resting in von Berg's extended palms. Every man in the room was silently running through the same mental calculation. They knew Patton's reputation. They knew his legendary temper, his deep-seated hatred for enemy leadership, and his strict insistence on protocol. An unscripted gesture from a surrendered commander could easily be read as a theatrical insult or a dangerous breach of decorum. Major Higgins braced for the sudden, furious outburst that normally shattered quiet rooms when someone crossed General Patton. Nobody dared to reach for the weapon, and nobody dared to speak. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from those present in the study that afternoon are remarkably consistent in their shape. They describe a silence that stretched far past the limits of ordinary military protocol, holding every officer in the room entirely still as Patton looked at the surrender offer. Patton did not reach for the polished sheath. He did not call for the guards to confiscate the antique weapon, nor did he deliver a theatrical lecture on victory and defeat. Not the way a general looks at an enemy trophy. Not the way a conqueror accepts the total submission of a fallen adversary. He looked at the silver-haired German officer the way a veteran looks into a mirror after a long and grueling journey. Slowly, Patton extended his right hand across the mahogany desk. He placed his fingers against the cold metal scabbard, gently pushed the Prussian cavalry dress saber back into the old general's palms, and looked him straight in the eyes. "Keep your family steel, General. The war is over." The words landed in the frozen study with the weight of absolute finality. General von Berg stood motionless for a moment, his chest rising and falling beneath his stripped uniform as his fingers closed around the silver hilt. Major Thomas Higgins would later record that specific second in his personal journal, noting how the heavy tension gripping the staff officers instantly dissolved into quiet astonishment. Patton did not wait for a formal response or a solemn salute. He simply nodded once, turned back to his field desk, and picked up a grease pencil, returning to the work of army administration as if the exchange had been the most natural thing in the world. Higgins described Patton's composure in that moment with a single word: deliberate. See, what most folks don't realize is that Patton was often judged solely by his public theater, his polished helmet, and his ferocious speeches to troops on the eve of battle. But beneath that carefully constructed persona lived a man who studied ancient history and recognized a warrior code that transcended modern politics. Patton knew that the war of combat was finished, and continuing to humiliate a defeated officer possessed zero operational value. Military strategy is an unyielding calculation of firepower, fuel, and physical destruction, but true command requires knowing when the arithmetic of violence stops. Stripping an elderly man of his family heritage would not add a single gallon of gasoline to Third Army trucks, nor would it feed a single prisoner. To Patton, taking that antique weapon was empty score settling. By pushing the steel back into von Berg's hands, he preserved honor without spending a single operational asset, drawing a firm line between the necessary destruction of war and the basic human dignity that must remain when the firing stops. General Friedrich von Berg was 61 years old, born in the garrison town of Potsdam near Berlin. His father had been a quiet Prussian quartermaster and horse breeder who raised his sons on a small countryside estate, teaching them that family iron was a quiet obligation rather than an ornate symbol of rank. The Prussian cavalry dress saber with silver hilt had belonged to von Berg's grandfather, crafted in a specialized armory in Solingen in 1870 and maintained with beeswax and oiled rags through 3 decades of peace. As an 18-year-old lieutenant in 1914, von Berg had carried that same scabbard across frozen trenches in East Prussia, learning early that armies rise and fall while simple steel remains. He was not a party member, nor was he a fanatic seeking glory in the physical ruins of a collapsing Reich. He was an aging soldier who wanted nothing more than to survive the final days of a catastrophic conflict. He had a younger sister named Clara who worked as a seamstress in a damaged stone cottage near Weimar, and his only realistic plan for the remaining years of his life was to return to a small rural village near the Elbe River to teach basic arithmetic and geometry to local children. He was not a romantic hero. He was not a political ideologue. He was the kind of man who measured his life by the durability of cold steel and the strict fulfillment of an ancient obligation. When von Berg stepped out of the quiet study with his heirloom weapon still attached to his waist, his reaction was remarkably understated. He did not celebrate, nor did he offer a dramatic speech to the American guards standing along the paneled corridor outside the heavy wooden doors. He simply clipped the brass hook back onto his worn leather service belt, adjusted his tunic with steady, practiced hands, and calmly asked a young military policeman where the prisoner transport vehicles were staged. As he climbed into the back of an open truck bound for the detention compound, he rested his weathered palm over the silver hilt of the Prussian cavalry dress saber, protecting the polished metal from the swirling dust of the Bavarian country road. Major Thomas Higgins, 34 years old from Dayton, Ohio, survived the remaining weeks of the European campaign and returned home to manage a regional hardware supply business for 35 years. He kept his Third Army operational diary locked inside an oak desk drawer, containing a single handwritten entry describing that quiet afternoon in May 1945. Until his passing in 1998, Higgins rarely recounted the grand tactical maps, the casualty reports, or the high-profile victories of the drive across Germany. Instead, he told his children and grandchildren about the single minute inside a requisitioned manor house, when an American general looked across a mahogany desk and decided that a defeated officer's family heirloom was worth preserving. Was Patton right to let a defeated German officer keep his family weapon? Some would say it was a dangerous breach of protocol, an unnecessary display of old-world chivalry toward a senior commander of an enemy force that deserved only total disarmament, rigorous cataloguing, and strict subjugation under Allied mandate. Others would say exactly the opposite, arguing that true command requires knowing when the cold mechanical machinery of war must yield to a deeper, unwritten code of mutual respect among veterans who understood the actual price of steel and survival. The philosophical line between necessary operational control and enduring human dignity remains as thin and sharp today as it was in that quiet Bavarian manor house in 1945. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.